What would you do if the people who were supposed to love you most had been quietly stealing from the one person who actually did? That question kept me up for months. And the answer, when it finally came, didn't arrive in a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived in a lawyer's office, in a cedar chest with a false bottom, and in 4 pages of handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. My name is Tessa Palmer. I'm 32 years old. And this is the story of how my grandfather built something so careful, so patient, and so precise that even death couldn't stop it from protecting me. Before we go any further, if you've ever watched someone's life get picked apart by people who should have guarded it, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And drop a like if you believe that truth, even when it comes late, still counts for something. Now let's go back to the beginning. Harold James Palmer was not a complicated man. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation. He drove a truck with 190,000 miles on it because it still ran. He ate lunch at the same diner every Tuesday for 40 years and always left a cash tip even when the service was slow. But underneath, that simplicity was something rare, a mind that measured everything twice. A man who understood that trust, real trust, is built the same way a house is, one honest layer at a time. He started Palmer and Sons Construction with a borrowed set of hand tools and a pickup truck when he was 22. By the time he was 50, his crews had framed half the homes between Stanton and Waynesboro. He sold the business at 72, but kept the land, kept the office, a cinder block building on Route 250 with his name stenciled above the door in letters he'd painted himself. He didn't sell that building. Some things you keep not because they're worth money, but because they're worth memory. I grew up in that office. Every summer from age 14, I sat at the metal desk in the back room and learned how to balance his books, receipts for lumber, invoices for concrete. Grandpa taught me to read a balance sheet the same way he taught me to measure a board, carefully, deliberately, and always twice. He used to say, "People make mistakes, numbers just record them." When his Parkinson's diagnosis came late stage, already progressing, I was the one who rearranged my life around his. I drove to his house every morning before work. I helped him eat. I read him the newspaper. I reconciled his accounts on his kitchen table while he dozed in the recliner with the television on low. My parents were too busy. That's what they said. My father Robert showed up on Sundays sometimes and stood in the doorway like a visitor who wasn't sure he'd been invited. My mother Linda, she had her own reasons for keeping her distance, reasons I didn't understand yet. 3 years I did this. 3 years of heated soup and tax filings and watching the strongest man I'd ever known slowly lose the fight against his own body. The day before he died, he pressed his pocket watch into my hand. Sterling silver, worn smooth from decades in his chest pocket. "Keep time for me, kiddo." Those were the last clear words he said to me. I've carried that watch every day since. The funeral was at First Methodist in Stanton. 200 people came, old carpenters who'd worked his crews, neighbors, the woman from the hardware store who'd sold him nails for 40 years. I sat in the 3rd row. Linda had arranged the seating. She stood at the front in a black dress and her mother's pearls, accepting condolences with the practiced composure of someone who had rehearsed this moment. Robert stood beside her, gray suit, gray face, hands folded like a man waiting to be told what to do next. My cousin Derek had driven in from Charlottesville. New suit, fresh haircut. He worked the room like an open house, which is exactly the kind of man he was, always calculating the square footage of every situation he walked into. Nobody asked me to speak. I had spent 3 years at my grandfather's bedside, and nobody thought to hand me a microphone. It was at the reception, deviled eggs, sweet tea, people saying things like "he's in a better place," that I heard Linda talking to the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Bowden. Linda didn't bother lowering her voice. Harold just felt sorry for her. That's the only reason she was ever here. I heard every word. I didn't move. I wrapped my fingers around the pocket watch in my jacket and squeezed until the winding crown left a circle pressed into my palm. 2 days later, I drove to Grandpa's house to pick up my things. The deadbolt was new, brass, still shiny. Linda was on the porch with a cardboard box at her feet. "I packed what's yours," she said, smiling the way people smile when they're handing you something that was already taken. The box had a few changes of clothes, 2 paperbacks, some old notebooks, and the cedar chest, the one Grandpa had built me when I was 10. He'd planed the wood himself in his workshop, sanded it until the grain was silk, and carved my initials into the lid. "The house is part of the estate now," Linda said. "Robert and I are handling everything. It's what Harold would have wanted." Behind the screen door, Robert stood with a coffee mug. He didn't look at me. Mrs. Bowden was across the street watering her hydrangeas. She stopped, watched, didn't wave, just stood there with the hose running, witnessing everything. I picked up the box, tucked the cedar chest under my arm. "I'll need the rest of my things," I said. "There is no rest," Linda said. I loaded my car and drove 25 minutes east to my apartment in Harrisonburg, 600 square feet above a dry cleaner. The cedar chest rode on the passenger seat. When I parked, I checked my phone, 1 missed call. Area code 540, no voicemail. Grandpa had told me to wait. 6 months before he died, he'd called me into his workshop. He was in the wheelchair by then, hands trembling, but his eyes were the same as they'd always been, clear, patient, precise. "I need you to listen," he said. "Don't write this down, don't tell anyone." He told me about the trust. An irrevocable trust he'd set up 15 years earlier with a Richmond attorney named Margaret Caldwell. $20 million. The proceeds from selling Palmer and Sons, decades of investments, rental income from commercial properties he'd held quietly for years. I was the sole beneficiary. I remember my mouth going dry. The man who wore the same flannel shirt 3 days in a row had been building something invisible for 15 years. "That's my whole life," he said, "and I'm giving it to the only person who earned it." I tried to argue. He raised one trembling hand. "Margaret will contact you after I'm gone. She'll explain the rest. Until then, say nothing. Not to Robert, not to Linda, not to anyone." "The rest?" I asked. He looked at the pocket watch on the workbench. "You'll understand when it's time." Back in my apartment, I sat with that. Irrevocable meant untouchable. No probate court, no petition, no family pressure could reach it. I was safe. But I didn't know yet what the rest meant, so I waited. And while I waited, Linda moved fast. 3 days after the funeral, she filed a petition at the Augusta County Circuit Court. Her claim: Grandpa had died without a valid will. No trust, no estate documents, nothing. She signed a sworn affidavit saying exactly that. Robert co-signed it. His handwriting on the form was shaky, the R in Robert trailing off the line like it wanted to escape. Derek was already working the property angle. Court filings, I found later, showed he had initiated the transfer of 2 parcels of Grandpa's land. A 5-acre plot in Waynesboro appraised at $280,000. A commercial lot on Greenville Avenue in Stanton worth $140,000. Both transfers listed Harold J. Palmer as grantor and Linda S. Palmer as grantee. Notarized by a man named Kevin Rudd, who worked at Derek's real estate office. I learned about the probate filing from Mrs. Bowden. She called on a Thursday evening, her voice careful. "Honey, I saw your mother at the courthouse today. I thought you should know." I thanked her, hung up, and sat at my kitchen table with my hands flat on the surface. The CPA in me understood exactly what was happening. Every day Linda moved forward was a day assets disappeared into her name. I could have called a lawyer immediately, but Grandpa had said to wait for Margaret. 5 days I sat with that. 5 days of trusting a dead man's instructions over my own professional instincts. On the 6th day, my phone rang. Area code 540. This time, someone was on the other end. Now, before I tell you about that call, let me go back 1 year, because something had happened that I'd let go of at the time, and I wouldn't fully understand it until much later. Grandpa was still alive. I was at his kitchen table, laptop open, reconciling his monthly accounts the way I did every month. 2 charges caught my eye: $12,000, $8,000, both labeled Medicare Supplemental Processing Fee. I flagged them and asked Linda about it. She was at the counter, pouring iced tea, completely relaxed. "Medicare reimbursement fees. The new plan has processing charges. I handled it with the billing office." I checked, there was a code that matched. The invoice formatting looked right: letterhead, provider number, date of service. I let it go. A year later, In my apartment with 3 years of Grandpa's financial records open on my laptop, I looked again. I sorted every transaction by description and filtered for the word processing. 17 charges across 18 months, 12,000 here, 8,000 there, 6,500, 9,200. The amounts varied just enough to look organic. Total, $100. Red and $67,000. No Medicare supplemental plan, charges processing fees 17 times. Nobody does. I'd seen this before in forensic accounting training. It's called structuring. You vary the amounts. You spread them across time. You make them look like noise until someone sits down and adds it all up. And then I checked the authorization forms for each charge. Every single one carried Robert's signature. Clean, steady. But that was the problem. By the dates on these forms, Robert's hands shook badly enough that he could barely hold a coffee cup. Yet these signatures had no tremor at all. The same hand that shook at Grandpa's funeral had apparently signed 6 figures in transfers without a single wobble. I was still staring at the screen when my phone rang. This is the part where things shift. If you've been watching this far and you recognize any of this, the careful accounting, the quiet erasure, the family that shows up only when there's something to take, stay with me. Because what happened next is the part Grandpa had been building toward for 15 years. All right, real quick, if this story is keeping you riveted, do me a favor right now. Tap the like button, leave a comment below telling me the most surprising detail so far, and share this with one person who should hear it. I'll see you right back here in 5 seconds. Margaret Caldwell's voice was the kind of calm that comes from 30 years of delivering difficult news in wood-paneled offices. She apologized for the delay. Grandpa had instructed her to wait 7 days after his passing before reaching out. "There's more than just the trust," she said. "We need to meet in person. Bring the cedar chest." The cedar chest. She knew about it. I drove to Richmond early the next morning. 2 hours east through the Blue Ridge, past Charlottesville, where Derek sold houses to people who trusted his handshakes. Margaret's office was on the 2nd floor of a converted townhouse. Bookshelves floor to ceiling. A brass lamp that probably cost more than my rent. Margaret herself was around 65, silver hair, gold-rimmed glasses, hands that moved with deliberate precision when she opened the first folder. "Your grandfather hired a forensic accountant 2 years before he died," she said. "A man named Ray Mitchell. He asked me to commission an independent audit of his personal accounts." She slid the report across the desk. 47 pages. I opened it, and the CPA and me went straight to the columns. Linda had moved $342,000 from Grandpa's personal accounts into 3 separate accounts over 28 months. One in her name, one in Robert's, one under a shell company called Palmer Family Holdings LLC, with Linda listed as sole member. The mechanism was meticulous. Fake vendor names. Fake W-9 forms generated on a home computer, with metadata timestamps matching a device registered to Linda's email address. Recurring charges with official-sounding names that corresponded to no real business registered in the state of Virginia. The 17 Medicare fees were just the start. There were also property maintenance assessments, estate planning consultation fees, and a recurring charge labeled Skilled Nursing Coordination that routed to a P.O. box registered to Derek's real estate office. $342,000 from personal accounts, another $78,000 through the shell company. Total, $420,000. "Your grandfather couldn't stop her," Margaret said. By the time Ray finished the audit, Harold's Parkinson's had progressed past the point where he could sign documents or testify. He couldn't fight her in court. She paused. But he could prepare someone who could. She slid a second folder across the desk. Thinner, 6 pages, a lab letterhead. "Your grandfather ordered this test 18 months ago. A DNA sample compared against Robert's medical records." I read the summary, 3 lines. 3 lines that rearranged everything. Robert Allen Palmer was not the biological child of Harold James Palmer. Probability of paternity, 0.01%. Margaret spoke carefully. "Your grandmother Gloria was pregnant when she and Harold married. Harold knew. Gloria told him before the wedding. He married her anyway and raised Robert as his own son. I stared at the lab seal. The room was very quiet. Harold never held it against Robert, she continued. He loved your father. But 3 years ago, when Linda started moving money, Harold realized something he hadn't wanted to face. Robert knew about his own parentage. He'd known since he was 18, Gloria told him on her deathbed, and Linda had discovered the secret early in their marriage. She used it as leverage. Every time Robert hesitated, every time he questioned a document she put in front of him, Linda reminded him that one phone call could expose everything. Robert signed whatever she asked because he was terrified of losing the only identity he'd ever had. I set the folder down. My grandfather had known the truth about Robert his entire adult life, had chosen to marry Gloria, had chosen to raise Robert, had given him his name, his company, 40 years of patience. And Robert had repaid that choice by handing the keys to a woman who methodically stripped the house while the old man was still breathing. Margaret asked about the cedar chest. "Check the bottom panel," she said. "Harold built it himself. There's a false bottom." I drove back to Harrisonburg with the folders on my passenger seat and the chest balanced on top. My apartment was quiet. Late afternoon light came through the kitchen window, making the dust particles look like snow. I set the chest on my bed and took everything out, the pencils, the old report cards, the county fair photo. Grandpa and me in 2004, standing beside a blue ribbon tomato that wasn't even ours. I ran my fingers along the bottom panel. Then I found the seam. A hairline crack along the left edge. I pressed. The panel shifted. The smell hit me first. Sawdust, fresh, like he'd sanded something recently and packed the shavings in as insulation. Like a message that said, "I was just here." 2 items in the hidden compartment. A sealed envelope with red wax and a small brass key. The kind that fits a safety deposit box. I broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper in Grandpa's blocky handwriting. Bank of Clark County, Stanton Branch, Box 1147. Use the key. 4 lines, no explanation. Just instructions from a man who measured twice and never wasted a word. I called Diana Walsh the next morning, a state litigation attorney based in Stanton. Diana specialized in probate disputes and fiduciary breach, and when I spread everything across her conference table, she read Ray Mitchell's forensic report in 20 minutes, took off her glasses, and said 4 words. "This is a crime." She looked at the brass key, and we need to know what that opens. At Bank of Clark County, the teller led me to the vault. Box 1147, the key fit clean. Inside the box was a thick manila envelope and a thin layer of sawdust on the metal floor. He'd put it there on purpose. The envelope held 3 things: the original trust document, notarized, witnessed by 3 independent parties, dated 15 years earlier. A certified copy of the DNA results with documented chain of custody, and 4 pages of handwriting I would have recognized anywhere. Harold's letter. I sat in the private viewing room, closed the door, and read it. He wrote about Gloria, about the day she told him Robert wasn't his, about marrying her anyway because he had already decided the kind of man he wanted to be. "I knew before he was born," he wrote. "I chose anyway, not because I had to, because that's who I wanted to be." He wrote about Linda, about watching her charm his son and then, slowly, methodically dismantle every financial safeguard he'd spent decades building, about the Parkinson's that stole his ability to fight back. "She's been taking from me for years. I could have stopped her earlier. But I was afraid. Afraid that confronting Robert would force him to choose between his wife and his father. So I chose for him. I chose to protect my granddaughter instead." And then the line I carry with me every single day. "Blood doesn't make you family. What you do when nobody's watching does." His final instruction was simple. Use everything in this box to protect what I built, not for revenge, for truth. I folded the letter, sat in that room for 40 minutes, then I drove home and got to work. Let me stop here for a moment, because what comes next is the part that the numbers alone can't capture. Here's a small favor. If you want to see where this goes and you're not subscribed yet, here's your sign. Hit that button. And while you're at it, Send this video to someone who takes care of an elderly family member. They need to see this. Now back to Stanton, because the courtroom is about to get very quiet. The hearing was on a Tuesday in October. The maples along Route 250 were turning. That deep, honest red that only comes when the nights get cold enough to strip away everything a tree doesn't need. Augusta County Circuit Court, Courtroom 2, wood-paneled walls, an American flag that needed ironing. The kind of room where the truth gets weighed on a Tuesday while the rest of the town goes to work. At our table, Diana Walsh, me, the cedar chest, entered as Exhibit A. Margaret Caldwell behind us, silver hair, hands folded. Ray Mitchell beside her, 2 copies of his report. At their table, Philip Brock, Linda's attorney, yellow legal pad, pen clicking, the practiced energy of a man who charges by the hour. Linda beside him in navy blue. Same pearls from the funeral. Robert at the end of the table, staring at the wood grain. Derek sat in the front row of the gallery, nearest the exit. Mrs. Bowden was in the second row, Chew. RCH dress, bifocals, sitting straight as a fence post. A reporter from the Stanton News Leader had a notebook on her knee. Judge Martha Hensley entered. We rose, she sat, we sat. Diana called Margaret to the stand first. Margaret testified for 40 minutes. The trust was created 15 years ago at Harold's request, funded by the proceeds from selling Palmer and Sons, plus decades of careful investment. Irrevocable. Tessa Palmer named as sole beneficiary. Harold was 70 years old at the time of execution, fully competent, still running a construction company. A physician's letter confirming legal competency was attached to the original document. Brock tried to shake her on cross-examination. Margaret was precise in a way that made his questions look small. Then Ray Mitchell took the stand. The projector hummed. His spreadsheets filled the screen, columns of dates, amounts, account numbers, vendor names that didn't correspond to any registered business in the Commonwealth of Virginia. He walked the court through 28 months of transactions. The fake Medicare fees, the shell company, the W-9 forms generated on a home computer whose metadata pointed directly to Linda. $342,000 from Harold's personal accounts, $78,000 through Palmer Family Holdings, $420,000 total. Then Dr. Carol Fenton's video deposition played on the courtroom monitor. Her conclusion was clinical and precise. The signatures on the property transfer documents were inconsistent with Harold's known handwriting from the same time period. The tremor patterns present in authenticated samples were entirely absent from the questioned documents. In her professional opinion, Harold Palmer had not signed those transfers. Then Diana read Kevin Rudd's sworn statement aloud. Derek had asked him to notarize the property transfer documents without Harold present. He had been told Harold signed them at home earlier. He had not verified. He had not seen Harold. He had not confirmed anything. Derek's foot stopped bouncing. Linda's hands, clasped on the table in front of her, went white at the knuckles. Judge Hensley removed her glasses and looked at Brock. Does your client wish to respond to the accounting discrepancies? Brock straightened his tie. We'd need additional time to review the forensic. You've had 30 days, counselor. Diana stood again. Your Honor, there is one additional piece of evidence relevant to the petitioners standing in this proceeding. She handed a folder to the clerk. This is a certified DNA analysis, performed 18 months before Harold Palmer's death, at his own request, through his personal physician. Chain of custody is fully documented. She read the summary. With 99.98% certainty, Robert Allen Palmer is not the biological child of Harold James Palmer. The courtroom shifted. Mrs. Bowden's hand went to her mouth. The reporter's pen stopped. One of the old carpenters from Grandpa's crew, a man I recognized from the funeral, shook his head slowly, the way you do when something you half suspected turns out to be true. Robert didn't deny it, didn't stand up, didn't perform shock. He just sank into his chair like a building settling into its foundation. His hands went flat on the table. His face went the color of old concrete. And then he said it, almost to himself, quiet enough that the court reporter leaned forward. He knew, he always knew, and he still kept me. For one full second, the courtroom was completely still. I looked at my father and saw something I hadn't expected. Not the man who signed documents he didn't read. Not the man who stood behind a screen door while I carried a cardboard box to my car. I saw the boy Harold had chosen. The boy who'd spent his whole life trying to earn a place he already had. Then Linda grabbed his arm. "Don't say another word." And the moment broke. Brock scrambled to recover. He argued the DNA was irrelevant under Virginia inheritance law. A child raised by a parent holds legal standing regardless of biology. Diana nodded. "We agree. We're not challenging Robert's legal standing. We're demonstrating that the petitioner's entire narrative, that they are Harold's sole legitimate family, and that Tessa is an outsider who manipulated a sick old man, is a fabrication." She turned to face Linda. Harold Palmer knew the truth about Robert's parentage and chose to raise him anyway. He also chose, over 15 years, with full legal competence, to entrust his legacy to the one person who proved she deserved it. Not through blood, through conduct. Linda couldn't hold it. She was on her feet before Brock could stop her. "This is ridiculous. That girl sat in his house and turned him against his own family. She's a bookkeeper. She doesn't deserve." "Mrs. Palmer," Judge Hensley's voice was flat, "sit down." Linda didn't sit. She poisoned him against us. She took advantage of a sick old man who didn't know what he was. I didn't raise my voice. I used the same tone I use when I'm presenting audit findings to a client who already knows the numbers are bad. "He didn't feel sorry for me," I said. "He felt sorry for you." Linda stopped. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. The only sounds in the room were the scratch of the reporter's pen and the pocket watch ticking against my ribs. "Sit down, Mrs. Palmer," the judge said again. "I won't ask again." Linda sat. Her hands were shaking, not like Robert's, not with grief or shame, but with rage. The kind that comes when the story you've been telling yourself for decades gets read back to you by someone who actually checked the receipts. Judge Hensley issued her ruling from the bench. The irrevocable trust was valid, established during documented competency, properly witnessed, legally binding. The property transfers were void, forged signatures, fraudulent notarization, fiduciary breach. Full restitution of all misappropriated funds was ordered. The criminal evidence was referred to the Augusta County Commonwealth Attorney's Office for investigation. Brock didn't appeal. Derek had already left. He'd slipped out during the DNA testimony and hadn't come back. In the hallway outside, I was walking toward the exit with the cedar chest under my arm when I heard footsteps behind me. "Tessa." I stopped. Robert stood 3 feet away, tie loose, eyes red. I signed what she told me to sign. His voice cracked on the last word. Every paper, every form, I didn't ask what they were. "Why?" "Because she said if I didn't, she'd tell everyone about who I really am." I looked at my father. "Grandpa knew, Dad, he always knew, and he never stopped calling you his son." Robert broke. Standing in that courthouse hallway under fluorescent lights, next to a bulletin board advertising jury duty. My father cried like a man who had been holding something too heavy for too long and finally set it down. I didn't hug him, I didn't forgive him, but I didn't walk away either. I stood there, holding the cedar chest Grandpa built, until he was done. That was the last time we stood in the same room for a long time. Now, before the final chapter, if this story has moved you at all, if it's made you think about someone in your life, someone elderly, someone vulnerable, someone whose finances you should probably be paying closer attention to, do something small right now. Share this video, not for the algorithm. For the person watching it 3 weeks from now at 2 in the morning who needed to know they're not alone. Okay, here's how it ended. The Commonwealth attorney moved efficiently. Linda was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, and obtaining money by false pretenses. She took a plea, 18 months suspended, 3 years of supervised probation, and full restitution of $420,000. No prison time, but a felony record that would follow her through every background check for the rest of her life. Derek was charged with forgery and conspiracy. He received 12 months suspended and permanently surrendered his real estate license. His wife filed for divorce before his sentencing hearing. Kevin Rudd lost his notary commission and was barred from seeking reinstatement for 10 years. Robert cooperated with the investigation. He wasn't charged. The Commonwealth determined his involvement had been passive, documents signed under coercion, participation driven by fear. He moved out of Grandpa's house and into a studio apartment across town. He filed for divorce. Last I heard, he was working maintenance at a storage facility off Interstate 81. Grandpa's house was returned to the trust. The 2 parcels of land were restored. I didn't move into the house. I kept my apartment in Harrisonburg, 600 square feet above the dry cleaner. The place that was mine before any of this started. The place that was still mine when it was over. 6 months after the hearing, I used a portion of the trust to establish the Harold Palmer Community Foundation. The mission was simple: trade school scholarships for students in the Shenandoah Valley. Carpentry, electrical, plumbing, the work Grandpa believed in, the work that builds things that last. The foundation office is Grandpa's old workshop on Route 250. I had it renovated: new wiring, new plumbing, fresh paint on 3 walls. The 4th wall I left alone. Original wood paneling, scuffed and stained, still carrying the faint ghost of sawdust in its grain. Some things you don't sand away. The first class had 8 students. Mrs. Bowden came to the opening. She brought a lattice-top peach pie and wore the same church dress she'd worn to the hearing. She stood in the workshop, looked at those 8 young people sitting in folding chairs, and said, "Your grandfather would be proud." I said he'd have told me I overworked the budget. She laughed. It sounded like something filling back up. There's a pocket watch on my desk now. Sterling silver, worn smooth. It sits next to the cedar chest on the shelf behind me in a workshop that smells like fresh paint and old wood. When the room is quiet, I can still hear it ticking. Grandpa wrote it in his letter. I've said it before and I'll say it one more time because it's the truest thing I know. Blood doesn't make you family. What you do when nobody's watching does. I didn't inherit $20 million. I inherited a standard. A way of measuring the world, carefully, honestly, and twice. 1 cedar chest, 1 stubborn accountant, and a grandfather who kept building things even after his hands stopped working. He built a trust that couldn't be touched. He built evidence that couldn't be buried. He built a letter that spoke louder than any testimony. And he built a false bottom in a wooden box so that even in death, he could still hand me exactly what I needed. If this story reminded you to check who holds power of attorney over someone you love, take that as a sign. Do it this week. Not next month. This week. Make the call, ask the question, look at the numbers. Because sometimes the people building systems against someone you love are the ones sitting at the same dinner table. And sometimes the person who protected you most was the one who never said a word about it until it was time. Thank you for watching. If this hit something real for you, leave a comment. I read them. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And share it because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that truth has a way of keeping time, even when everything else tries to run it down. I'll see you in the next one.